Now, with our main.dart file now being totally empty, I will first of all walk through some programming and Dart fundamentals before we continue rebuilding our app from scratch. Now, if you already are a more experienced developer, if you worked with JavaScript or Java or C#, then you will already know a lot of the things I'm going to explain. Still, there will be some Dart specifics, and therefore I would recommend that you don't skip this lecture, but instead maybe just ramp up that playback speed if it's boring to you. If you're brand new to programming or you're never programmed before, well, then you should definitely follow along. Now, for these basics, we'll not stay here in our project at the moment because we couldn't really execute that code here since we have no working app at the moment. But instead, you can Google for Dartpad, and that is a web-based playground that allows you to write some Dart code and run it in the browser. And that's exactly what I have here. This is a little demo starting project which we start with, but we'll write our own code here in a second. So this is Dart code, not a Flutter app, just normal Dart code. You could also use Dart for web development. This is just some dummy Dart code where we see the output here on the right in the console, and it's perfect for learning the basics about Dart. Now, what do we have here? The overall thing we have here, this main thing, that is a so-called function. Functions are a crucial concept in pretty much any programming language you're going to learn. Functions are code snippets which you can execute multiple times and at any time you want. This function here is named main because the thing in front of the parentheses here is the so-called function name. The parentheses themselves are always required for every function you define, and they allow you to receive so-called arguments that would be input to your function. And this function simply doesn't take any arguments. Nonetheless, it needs these parentheses to turn it into a function. Then we have curly braces, the green ones here right now. Curly braces surround the so-called function body. That is the code which executes when this function gets called. And I will show you how to call a function in a second. Void here, that is a so-called type. Dart is a typed language, which simply means that everything in Dart has a type. Here, that is the type of data which this function returns. This function returns nothing, and therefore the return type is void. It's empty, so to say. Here we see a number type in this strange for thing, to which I'll come back later. This would be the type of I. I holds a number, a so-called integer. But more on that in a second. Let's not learn too much at the same time. So this is a function called main. It has no arguments and it returns nothing and therefore has a return type of void. This is the function body. Main is a special function name. Generally, you can give your functions any name you want, but main is a special name because main is the entry point of a Dart application. Dart automatically calls the main function for you when the app starts. Therefore, in a Flutter app, when you add main in the main Dart file, which is also a special file for which Flutter will look for, when you add a function called main here, by adding parentheses and by adding void in front of it, this is the first function which Dart and Flutter will execute automatically when your app launches. So into this function, you need to put the code that basically kicks off that UI rendering work that brings something onto the screen. More on that in a second. So that's a function, and main is a special kind of function. Now, because it's a special kind of function, you probably also can create other functions, right? And you can. Let me first of all remove that code inside of the function. And let's add a new function above the main function. And I will name this add or add numbers. That name is now totally up to you, but you should follow a naming convention, which is called camel case, where you have only one word, so no blank in between. That would actually be a syntax error. But you have one word, and if your word actually consists of multiple words, like this one, add and numbers, then all words should always start with a capital character, even right inside of the word. But the first word always starts with a lowercase character. So you have add numbers. If this would just be called add, then you would also start with a lowercase character, but any other word in there has an uppercase character. That's just a naming convention which we use in Dart and also in many other programming languages, which you should memorize and use so that when other developers see your code, they have an easier time understanding it. Now, as I mentioned, a function can take arguments, so input. Now, the main function didn't take any arguments, but let's say add numbers is a function which should hold some code to add two numbers. And therefore, this will now take two numbers as an input. So between the parentheses here, we can add num1 and num2. And just as the function name, these names are also up to you. You can name that whatever you want. And as you see here, you simply add commas as a separator between your different arguments in the list of arguments here. Now you also need a function body, and you add that by using curly braces. That simply tells Dart that in between the curly braces, you have the code that should execute when this function gets called. So when you instruct it to execute the code inside of add numbers. Now you do instruct Dart to execute this function by using its name, now in the main function, which is the code that first runs when the app starts. So in here, in main, you simply call add numbers by its name. And now here you also need to add parentheses. You always need to do this, even if the function takes no arguments. This function, however, does take arguments. So now between these parentheses, you add the concrete values, which will be passed to add numbers. So that num1 and num2 do have actual data with which they can do their work. So here we could add 1 and 2. Now, of course, this function doesn't do anything at the moment, though. I call it with 1 and 2 here, but we have no logic in there to really add these numbers. So what we can do in here is we can call num1 plus num2, and now we would add that. Now, we also need to add a semicolon. That's another thing in Dart. For every expression you have in your code, for every code line, you have to add a semicolon in the end. Exceptions from the rule are the definition of functions, where you don't add a semicolon after this curly brace here, but you do add it here for all the code inside of your functions, so to say. And in general, for all these block statements, as they are called, so these statements where you have code between curly braces, you don't add a semicolon after the curly braces, you only add semicolons after the expressions between curly braces. So here we have num1 plus num2. I added this semicolon here, but the problem we now have is we add two numbers here, and that would generally work, but we're not doing anything with the result of this operation. Now you could think that it should automatically be output here on the right. Well, let's see. Let's click run. What happens is that we have an empty output here on the right. So that's not really helpful. Now in programming, you always have to be very clear about what should happen, because the programming language, Dart in this case, does not make any assumptions. Why would it print it here? You don't tell it to do that, and therefore it doesn't do it. Now you can print the result by using the print function. Print is not a function we defined, it's a function that was that's built into Dart. And you can wrap num1 plus num2 with print, and if you now hit run, you will see 3 here on the right. So now this works. Now we're outputting the result of num1 plus num2. So this is our first little piece of Dart code, and yet we can improve that. For example, we don't use types here, but Dart is a strongly and a strictly typed programming language. That means that you have to be clear about which type of data your arguments are, or this function returns. That is something which helps the Dart compiler to yell at you when you write code that violates that. If you don't assign your own types, which we'll do in a second, then Dart will assume that this is of the dynamic type, a type built into Dart, which, as the name suggests, doesn't tell too much about the type. It basically accepts any value, and therefore it won't really help you that much with checking that you're writing proper code. So if possible, you should avoid that dynamic type and assign explicit types when working with Dart. Now, there are a couple of built-in types in Dart. Everything in general is a so-called object, which is a data structure that has, some complex logic inside of it, possibly at least. And we'll create such objects later too. But there are certain special types of objects, you could say. There is text, for example, and you create text by using quotation marks. So here, if I type hello and I print this, please note the quotes. You can use single or double quotes, that doesn't matter, but you shouldn't mix them. So if you open it with a double quote, you also have to close it with a double quote. I will use single quotes in this course though. And this creates a so-called string data type. So this is a value which is of type string. Text simply is a string. If we now hit run here, we'll see hello being printed because, well, I'm printing this here, and therefore we see the output here. So text, strings, are one data type. Besides the text, for our numbers, we have so-called integers and we have floats or doubles. Integers are numbers without any decimal places, like 29 or 43 or -10. Floats or doubles are numbers with decimal places, like 29.99, -10.56, something like that. So here, these two numbers would actually be integers. Now, in this function here, we should be clear about the fact that this only works with integers. And we do that by adding int in front of each argument. This tells Dart that num1 and num2 both have to be integers. So if I now run this, it will still work. But if I would pass 2.5 or 2.6 here, then we actually automatically get an error here in the bottom right corner that our argument of type double can't be assigned to a parameter. Parameter is basically a different word for argument of type int. And that is why Dart does use these types, because it allows us to write cleaner and better code. If we know that this function should only work with integers, then we should define it as such. And if we then later, somewhere else in our code, accidentally call that with a double, we get an error. And we get that error before we ship our code into the Flutter app, so into the app stores, for example. And that is, of course, good. We want to catch and fix errors whilst we are developing. So here, we would get an error. Now we have two possible fixes. Either we fix our code such that we only call that with an integer value, or if we see, no, this should actually also work with doubles, well, in such a case, we could, of course, change that and accept doubles as inputs. And now if we run this code would work again, and it would output a double here with a decimal place, because now we allow doubles here. Now, of course, you could think, why don't we always use a double then? It's more flexible than an int. Well, sometimes you have situations where you really only want to have numbers without decimal places. Let's say you have some counter, which only increments by 1 at a time. Well, then you should be clear about that being an int so that you can't accidentally run the code with an invalid value with a decimal value. Now, side note, we could have also used num here, which is the overarching number type, and that would allow both ints and doubles. But as you see, if we use double here, this also allows us to call this with a 1, because this implicitly is converted to a double. So we can really use double here if you want to allow both double and int. So this works, and with that we learned about text, so-called strings, and about numbers where we have integers and doubles. And that all can be used as types, which we, for example, pass to a function. Now, this function, however, might also return something, or it might not. And you should therefore also always add a type information about what type of data this function returns. Now, this function prints the result, and therefore it does not return anything to the place where we call it. Hence, the correct type here would be void. Void is a special type in Dart, which basically means nothing. This function returns nothing. Now, why is that important? Because if we now, for example, wanted to print the result of add numbers here, like this, then we get an error that the expression here has a type of void and therefore can't be printed. We can't print the result of us calling add numbers because add numbers doesn't return anything. Sure, it prints something, but that is done from inside the function. Here, we would want to print what this function gives back. and this function doesn't give us anything back. However, we could actually make sure that it does. Instead of printing in here, let me comment this out, which you can do by adding 2 forward slashes. Now this code won't be considered. And this is a common pattern, by the way, that you comment out code which you don't want to run, but maybe you want to use it later, so you don't want to delete it, but you simply comment it out so that it's still there but not executed. And now we could return something here by using a special keyword in Dart, which is return. Now this is a keyword which tells Dart that this will now return something to the place where you called the function. So here I return num1 plus num2. And now what this does is, now here, this is valid code, because now here we print the result of add numbers, and the result is what add numbers returns, and here we return 2 numbers. If I now run this, we get an error though, that we can't return a value because this expression has a return type of void. And again, this is a good thing. We defined that add numbers doesn't return anything, that it returns nothing, and yet we do return something here. Now the solution is to change the return type here. And here we can change this to double, because since we add 2 doubles, we will always return a double. So now I'm returning a double here. And now if I call this function and I run this, now we don't get an error and we see 3.6 here instead. And this is how you should write Dart code. You should use these types. You have the core types of string and numbers, where we have integers and doubles. We have a couple of other types too, which we'll learn about throughout this course. And this is a core concept of Dart, just as functions are a core concept of Dart. Because now we can call add numbers here as often as we want. So I can also call add numbers here with 2 ones, for example. And this is a really useful pattern and feature which you have in basically any programming language, because it allows you to write code once, this logic for adding code, and you can call it with different inputs as often as you want. And therefore functions are a really important concept in programming and also in Dart.